Okay, what is going on, guys? It's Char here, and today I'm bringing you guys a new series. It's just going to be kind of, it's low key, something that's a bit more easy to record, easy to listen to, and digest. There's not going to be a ton of visuals in this video, so if you want to throw me on a side tab or just listen like a podcast, feel free to go ahead and do that. I just want something that was a little more easy to produce, and there's a couple other reasons why we're starting this, but it is called Charred Takes. So basically what this is it's just going to be a series where I sit down in front of the webcam and discuss a couple things, usually relating to Marvel Champions, but maybe in the content space and things such as that. I want to quick disclaimer for all the videos: these opinions are completely my own. Of course, you can feel free to agree or disagree with me. I'm not really here to influence, more so just speak out my opinions and maybe think of them a bit more as I'm speaking. I encourage a lot of discussion in the comment sections, and I will be reading and replying to every single comment. So if you agree with what I had to say, disagree, have a different perspective, please leave it in the comment section below. I want it to be a chill series where you can sit back, listen, get some ideas, get those ideas flowing on your own, and discuss in the comments below, and we can maybe come to some sort of constructive dialogue. So the main premise of this series isn't going to be anything major. It's basically just some branding for a discussion series, but we can make it kind of fun if you want to. I want you guys to let me know if my take, like if I was cooking on my take that I had, or if it was charred, which of course we're the charred gambit here, which means it was in the oven for a bit too long. A hot take, a charred take, one and the same. Let me know if I'm, off of my, rocker, off of the deep end in the opinion I had, or you kind of agree with me. So this week, what I want to talk about, introducing the series out of the way, this week, what I had on my mind was difficulty in Marvel Champions. And that was a topic I was thinking a lot about because of the weekly challenge. So it wasn't specifically this week's weekly challenge. I think, I can't even remember what this week is for. I think it's a Crossbones one. Last week was playing against Ebony Maw, and the challenge was essentially just playing against him in heroic mode. So I don't have a ton of experience with heroic mode. Again, I still haven't beat every villain on expert, so I'm slowly easing into more difficult content and things such as that. But when I saw the weekly challenge, I was like, there was a couple things for me. One, it wasn't much of a challenge in my opinion, not to roast Fantasy Flight Games for trying. No, I love the weekly challenges. I think, especially with multiplayer, sitting down with the play group, hammering these out every week, it's super fun. I want them to keep doing it, of course. It's not really a criticism on that. It's more of a criticism on difficulty, perceived difficulty, and how I enjoy the game at this point in time. Because the challenge is essentially heroic mode, I just wasn't really excited to try and create a video or content for that weekly challenge. I had missed the previous week one, which is the Alter Ego one, but that was because I wanted to do like a Halloween video. Didn't want to overwhelm myself with too many videos, but as you saw, there was no video last week. So my only experience with heroic mode was in another one of the weekly challenges when we were talking about the Venom one, where you had to put in Venom's encounter nemesis set into the actual Venom villain, but there was one card in there that was really brutal and punishing, and I did get it in my playthrough. It was called Clintar Frenzy. Normally it's not a big deal, but because we were fighting the Venom enemy, that card states a threat cannot be removed from it while there's a symbiote enemy in play, and since the enemy we were facing against was Venom, it could never be removed, and it had an extra encounter card icon on it, so I was essentially playing that in heroic mode. My experience, even though I have a lot of fun playing Marvel Champions, just getting that taste of heroic mode, even for that little bit of time where it honestly just seems unfair, and that's a discussion we'll get into in a little bit, but just getting double encounter cards, I was like, man, like I feel like I can do so little during my turn. The villain is doing so much, and it didn't feel like a challenge it was too challenging for my skill set, and it's something I wasn't prepared going into it for. And again, we're going to get into the subjective evaluation of fairness later in this video, but I thought it was an interesting, reaction I had to it. I've never played heroic mode before, but usually, I can remove the extra encounter card icon before I ever get one. In some scenarios, like Red Skull, sometimes you get a double, but those are like small caveats, and the game goes back to normal, quote unquote. But yeah, I want to get into like the first topic and just speak about difficulty broadly. So I think there is definitely a difference between objective and subjective difficulty when we're talking about this, and I think it's important to make that distinction. Now I'm gonna put another disclaimer here. I might use objective and subjective a bit incorrectly or get them mixed up from time to time as I'm speaking, but just trying to lay it out. Objective is like we're looking at without any opinions or anything like that, how difficult is a scenario, a mechanic, or whatnot, versus subjective, where some people might like some sort of difficulty more than other types of difficulty, and it makes it seem easier to them regardless of the objective difficulty. Here's an example real quick. So when we look at playing on standard, or not standard, but heroic mode versus non-heroic mode, getting 2 encounter cards per phase is objectively more difficult than getting 1, and that's just like if I wanted to like spell that out, the idea is just sort of like, imagine you get Shadows of the Past for your 1 encounter card, but if you're playing on heroic, let's say you get Shadows of the Past and Exhaustion. That is just way worse. It's not even close to being comparable. Shadow of the Past is already bad. Exhaustion is going to exhaust your identity and then surge into another card. It just goes crazy at that point. So objectively, heroic mode is more difficult. Now here's where we get to subjective difficulty. So sometimes you'll get side schemes with the extra the acceleration icon, or maybe the one that gives like an extra point to like the villain activations. I forget what that one's called, or the extra encounter card. There's like 3 different types of icons, or the crisis icon. There's like 4 different type of icons that can be on a side scheme. To somebody subjectively, of course, I always try and get rid of all threats on the boards when I play personally, but someone might not mind the extra acceleration at the beginning of the step 1 of the villain phase versus the one that gives them extra damage and scheme when they activate against you. There could be a subjective evaluation where some people are like, oh, I don't mind the extra acceleration icon, so I'll leave it there for a turn or 2 because it doesn't really stress me out. Whereas someone maybe somebody else sees that extra acceleration is like, oh no, I need to remove this immediately. And when I get those, I feel like this is a harder encounter card than getting something that buffs the villain activations by 1. So when we're speaking about heroic mode broadly and challenge in this game, I feel like a lot of players' fun and their willingness to engage in the game is making sure that the subjective difficulty for them is difficult enough to be a challenge without being too great of an obstacle to get over. But the whole point of that section was pretty broadly just to explain what I meant by objective and subjective difficulty to hopefully move forward into these later sections. Okay, let's go to the second point, which is talking about player skill and the ability to execute complex strategies. Both of these factor into a player's subjective experience with difficulty in the game and how it affects how much fun they're having or their willingness to play the game again. An example of player skill I use as a common shorthand example is when I was starting the game, I played a lot of She-Hulk. She was my favorite core box hero by far. It wasn't even close. I loved how her mechanics interacted with the flipping mechanic in the game. It felt really fun. It felt like it was taking advantage of the design space. I just thought she was really cool, regardless of some of her weaker hero cards. So what happened is I really wanted to take She-Hulk up to that next level. I was still mainly playing on standard, but I wanted to take on some of the harder villains. And I saw a deck list on Marvel CDB. I'm like, oh, this looks really cool. It was the leadership, strength in numbers, draw engine deck. Now, even though this deck was objectively better than any of the other core box aggression decks I was playing, I did not have the skill to actually execute on that deck. So regardless of how much better the deck was, because I wasn't able to actually execute the strategy in the deck, it made the subjective experience of villains I was able to defeat really easily. It made that subjective difficulty shoot way up, which is another important factor when talking about difficulty in this game, where not that every strategy should be simple, but it's important to keep that in mind when discussing difficulty in the game, that the more complex the strategy, the more moving parts, the harder perceived difficulty will be rather than objective difficulty. Of course, if we're talking about objective difficulty, like stated earlier, if you're using the recommended modular sets over a set number of games, the difficulty will, it will stay the same, right? Obviously, some games will be more swinging than others. You might get a couple surges, you might hit some expert and counter set cards, but over the grand scheme of all the games played, there will be some villains that are objectively more difficult because of their kit, because of the recommended modular sets, than different villains in under the same criteria. So the deck you're playing and the player skill and your ability to execute does affect that experience. A couple more examples I have to play is like it sort of ties into decision making, but not always. When you're a new player, when I was playing Iron Man as a new player, I didn't really get him. I think his baseline kit was too difficult for me to understand at the point. Like I understood it, but I wasn't able to execute well. And an example of this was like making sure to like mulligan hard for the arc reactor, mulligan hard for pepper pots. These just really strong cards, arc reactor in specific, how getting that ready just makes you so much more versatile. You can survive an exhaustion or any other encounter cards that exhaust your identity. You can thwart twice for 4. You can thwart, flip down, heal. There's just so many plays that open up with the arc reactor that if I was going to play like his Mark 5 armor, which just gives him like 6 health points, like that doesn't make a huge difference. But sometimes I would prioritize that because I'm like, oh, I need a bit more health. The value of the ready, I didn't really understand. Another aspect of this, sort of similar to the She-Hulk one, is people's frustrations when they pick up Doctor Strange because of community perception. Now, I think the perception on Doctor Strange has changed a little bit. He is extremely strong and definitely in the top 5 in the game, but people think that when they pick up Doctor Strange and play him, that it will solve all of their problems when it deals with subjective difficulty. Maybe some of these players who pick up this hero are like expecting the experience, their subjective difficulty to shoot way down, and they get surprised because what happens in their gameplay differs from what the common sentiment is, and they get frustrated with that. Like maybe they're losing as Doctor Strange against some villains they had defeated in the past before on quote-unquote weaker heroes. And that is definitely another aspect to this difficulty discussion here, where subjective difficulty and talking in online spaces is definitely influenced by your own subjective experience with the game, which aligns with your player skill, your ability to execute complex strategies, and so on and so forth. So for the third point, I want to speak on something that I sort of have an opinion about, and it's about playing optimal decks, playing optimal lines, and things like that when dealing with Marvel champions. So I think there's been some discussion in the community where sometimes villains are perceived as easier, and maybe they are objectively easier for sure, but it's because there's X, Y, and Z way to kind of trivialize their gimmick, work around the rules and things like that. Not really work around the rules, but work within the rules to kind of get advantages that aren't really obvious on a first, second, maybe even third play. And I wanted to just give my own opinion on this, where I think if people are having difficulties finding sort of a difficulty or like a fun zone where it's not too difficult for them, but it's also not too easy, playing around with the decks you make is another way to actually adjust that difficulty for something that's really comfortable and fun for you. You're going to see a lot of decks, especially when they're geared towards defeating the strongest villains in this game, that are going to have a lot of reoccurring cards. You're going to have stuff like the Helicarrier or some other 3-cost support that gives you like a resource. You're going to have like an Avengers Mansion. You're going to have Nick Fury. You're going to have Maria Hill. You're going to be playing leadership. There's really common trends and deck building trends that, they're become common over time because they are so consistent and they will help you win more games. And I wanted to push back on that notion a little bit, where if you think that a villain is too easy, kind of try and meet them on the same footing. Now, I'm not telling you to make decks that are non-functional or that don't work. I'm just saying that maybe not every deck needs to have that Nick Fury or that Maria Hill or triple make the call. These things that let you explore other avenues of the game, other aspects. And it's really, I think, needed, honestly, in the space, because this is where some of the best strategies and synergies have been found. If we settled on like one meta game where we only play specific cards, there would be so many different like archetypes and ways of play that would never have been discovered if everyone just kept going with what was the most optimal, or like the optimal play line of always doing this or that in a row, and not deviating, obviously deviation from like, the luck of the cards that you draw out of your deck, but not from like any fault of your own. I think it's a really interesting discussion. Obviously, there are other ways on the villain side that you can affect this as well, which is a good point of contention. If a villain is too difficult, throw in an easier modular set. Even if you're playing on expert on the hardest mode, you can go heroic heroic 2, heroic 3. Now, if someone cleared one of the hardest villains on heroic like 2 or 3, I would be shocked. I'm sure there's decks out there that can do it. And if you have fun operating in that space, more power to you. I just think that within the confines of the base game non-heroic mode, I think there's so much exploration still to be done nowadays to have fun with a lot of these weaker villains, or maybe even some of the stronger ones. And, playing some of the weaker heroes against the stronger ones, finding new synergies and things like that. I think it's important not to get too stuck in your ways, too stuck in the deck building ways, and trying to expand out of your comfort zone, play a couple of aspects you're not familiar with. Because if you're having too easy of a time with a villain, and maybe you've played him a lot of times, maybe play a hero you rarely play in an aspect that's your weakest, and you'll see, even though his objective difficulty has not changed whatsoever, the subjective difficulty for you may have gotten into that sweet spot that you like it. At least for me, I like something that feels like I can, not something that feels like I can lose at any time, but something that feels manageable. They put a lot of threats on the board, but I know that with the ability of smart play and, building a good deck, I can manage these threats effectively and actually defeat the villain. That's kind of where I operate, not something more on a bit more of a challenge side than being easier. If we're doing, I don't really know how to quantify that at all. I do like the challenge, just not an overwhelming amount, and that is different for every person. So I'd encourage everyone to, find what that is for them and find ways to reach that desired state of difficulty. And now to the last point, and this one is just covering what I was sort of alluding to at the beginning of the video, which is fairness, fun, and strength discussions. So when we're talking about fairness, this is another idea which isn't super agreed upon even in like our actual lives. What is fair? And I think it differs from person to person. So using an anecdote for myself, talking about the heroic mode challenge with Ebony Maw, playing the game, I play the game to have fun, and some of that fun comes in having a good level of difficulty. And any experience I've ever had with a heroic type of difficulty has never been fun. And I don't think I'm ready at this point to even try and take a dive to trying to learn the fun in heroic. For me, and because of the outlines of how I've always played the game, how I learned the game, and how it's taught, heroic kind of seems like if you're really like a thrill seeker, challenge seeker, you constantly want that difficulty to be almost basically overwhelming, and you want the game to swing on a couple encounter cards. Heroic seems like the difficulty for you. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm just really not ready to make that jump, and I don't know if I ever will, and that's okay. I operate in the difficulty where I just don't think getting extra encounter cards with nothing you can do about it is very fair to me in the confines of what I've come to expect from this game, and that's completely fine. I find my fun in playing with one encounter card every phrase. You get an extra one when you deck out. You get some extra hazard icons from side schemes and whatnot. Okay, that's great. But changing the core balance of the game from one encounter a card to double every villain phase is just not something I'm open to, and that's all right. That's why I've sort of had a hesitancy to go to some of the stronger villains in the game. You look at something like Ronin, he's basically playing on heroic. I know you do get a treachery cancel because of the Milano and whatnot, but that's why I've never actually fought Ronin. I've never even tried him on expert mode. I would assume my first win would be during the Rewind series, as you'll see coming up, but and yeah, it's just not something that I personally find fun, and that's all right. But I think that when we're talking about difficulty, there needs to be standards when talking about difficulty and strength of heroes. And I think that's like the final point I want to end on, because I don't think there really is a common consensus. And that's fine, because it can differ on the person you're talking to, what you're evaluating on, and whatnot. But I think when we're talking about the difficulty of villains and the strength of heroes, there needs to be some objective guidelines or like some objective standards set when you're discussing with somebody, so you guys aren't just like talking out of nowhere, right? You aren't just bringing up random anecdotes and points. You have to meet like, okay, these are the standards we're talking about. So, for example, what I'm referring to, let's say we're discussing the strength of the top 5 heroes in the game, but we're only considering standard. Like, okay, standard. I think that Doctor Strange is the strongest hero on standard because there's not, he gets a lot more time to build out. The villains aren't as difficult. There's a little less steady and stalwart in the game, so you can take advantage of his invocation deck, sure. But let's say someone comes in and that baseline wasn't set, and they're like, there's no way Doctor Strange is the strongest hero in the game because for this, this, and this, against the hardest villains, he struggles in this way. And these two people, they play on two completely separate axis of playing. They play on two completely separate, they're on two completely separate difficulty levels is kind of the idea I'm trying to get across. And according to themselves, right, they're both correct. And I think that there's an argument for both of them. But the thing is, since they're not agreeing on that baseline standard, they're never going to meet a consensus or even really be able to talk to each other. And I wanted to say, I think that these discussions are cool, fun, and interesting to be had, and no matter what difficulty you play on. I think it's just important that you're discussing with someone at a like-minded standard, because then you're going to get into miscommunications, you might get into some online arguments, and you guys just really won't be understanding one another when it could be sorted out by just having that baseline standard. So for me right now, when I'm talking about difficulty of villains and strength of heroes, my baseline, how I like to operate, is the expert villains with the recommended modular sets, and how heroes, how they face off against those expert villains, and that's their strength. I think there are interesting discussions to be had around the heroes that kind of revolve around stuns and confuses. You're talking about something like a Jubilee. I think there's definitely some discussions you can have on terms of how strong is she, ignoring all the steady and stalwart, and then a holistic, how strong is she compared to all the other heroes in the game, because steady and stalwart does exist and they are parts of the game. There's some interesting discussions to be had there. If I wanted to get a thesis statement to this video, I wanted to say difficulty Marvel Champions isn't this catch-all got him to be used in an argument or anything like that. I think that all types of players in this game and their opinions should be respected as long as you guys operate under the same conditions in which you discuss things. I don't think necessarily because you play on expert specifically, or because you play on expert heroic or whatnot, your opinion necessarily has more weight than someone who only plays on standard. I think it has more weight when specifically talking about expert, heroic, and whatnot, tier list and difficulty ratings and strength ratings. It doesn't necessarily, I would argue, it doesn't have as much merit, but then I would argue, right, it doesn't have as much merit as a person who plays only standard, and they're all like, well, in this standard experience, this villain is way more difficult than this one, or this hero is way stronger than this one, right? And I think there's a ton of discussions to be had about difficulty, and I think it's another important point to point out that you shouldn't be ashamed of the difficulty you play on. Everyone has their own perceived level of fairness and fun, and what difficulty is fun to them to be found in this game, and I think you should embrace it, but also don't get too stuck in your ways on it. I was really hesitant to reach out beyond standard because my initial fairness rating of expert was that it was unfair. It was too hard. But I think when people can kind of bounce around these difficulties, maybe someone who plays on expert, take a dip into standard for a little bit, kind of like a lower powered or maybe a new strategy you're trying out, and you'll find a lot of fun in that way because you're on an even playing field. And the opposite of someone who's playing on standard maybe wants a little bit more of a challenge, try some of the easier expert villains. I think there's so much fun and so much to talk about, and to be so much fun, so much to talk about, and there's just so many things to do in this game, and I think difficulty is just one of the axes that there can be a ton of discussion. Let me know down below if I was cooking with my take in this video or if it was charred. I just want to see all the comments you guys have. Let's open some discussion down below, keep it civil, and let me know what you guys thought. I hope you guys enjoyed this new video format. Hopefully we'll have some more coming in the future. But of course, as always, leave a like down below. Subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you guys in the next video. Take it easy. Goodbye.